I want you to understand something before we go any further. I was not supposed to be kneeling on a warehouse floor with concrete dust in my lungs and a gun pressed so hard into the back of my skull that I could feel the manufacturers stamping on the muzzle. I was supposed to be grading spelling tests. I was supposed to be a fourth-grade teacher in a cardigan, the kind of woman whose biggest Friday night crisis was whether the dry cleaner had her blazer ready. But there I was, Marcus's hand shaking so violently against my scalp that the barrel kept tapping my skin like Morse code written in fear. The air tasted like sulfur and wet concrete and something coppery underneath it that I didn't want to name yet. And then the smoking doorway at the far end of the warehouse breathed him out of the dark. Ryu Jin-woo. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he walked, unbothered, unhurried, like a man crossing his own living room, through a breach his own men had just blown into the wall. And when he was close enough that I could see the muscle ticking once, twice, at the corner of his jaw, he did something I will never, as long as I live, stop replaying behind my eyes. He reached down, unclipped the holster at his ribs, let two custom-engraved firearms fall to the concrete with a sound like a verdict. And then Ryu Jin-woo, the ice prince of the Incheon underworld, a man I had watched empty a room with a single look, sank to his knees in a puddle of someone else's blood, ruining $11,000 of bespoke charcoal wool without so much as glancing down. "I will sign over the ports," he said. His voice did not shake. That was the terrifying part, how level it was, like he was reading a grocery list instead of surrendering an empire. The shipping lines. The entire $200 million ledger. Just take your hands off her. A pause. And in that pause I felt Marcus's whole body go rigid behind me, before I peel them from your wrists. I was supposed to be a fourth-grade teacher, quietly swallowing my pride over a dead carnation at a rooftop restaurant, to understand why the most lethal apex predator in Seoul was currently trading his entire empire for my life. We have to go back 72 hours. To the dinner I almost didn't survive. 3 days earlier, I was sitting alone at a table for two. I want to describe that table to you, because I think about it more than I probably should. White cloth, pressed so crisp it looked like it could cut you. A single dead carnation drooping in a bud vase, its edges gone the brown-orange of old bruises, like the restaurant hadn't thought a woman dining by herself deserved a fresh one. 28 floors above Gangnam, the whole city spread out beneath the glass like something spilled and glittering. I had ordered the grilled sea bass because it was the cheapest thing on the menu that still photographed well, in case anyone was watching. Someone was always watching. That's the first thing you learn in that world. The rooftop restaurants, the CNBC circuit Marcus used to drag me through. Every table is a stage, and every stranger is an audience member deciding, right now, in real time, whether you're worth anything. The condensation was sliding down my water glass in slow, fat drops. I kept my eyes on it instead of on the table 11 feet away, where Marcus was holding court with two of his fraternity brothers turned business partners, all three of them in linen so pale it looked bleached, laughing at a volume specifically calibrated to reach me. I felt my spine curl inward, degree by degree, the way it always did around him, like my body was trying to take up less space in the world before he could make me do it himself. I want to tell you that I hated him in that moment, cleanly, simply, the way you're supposed to hate a man who's humiliated you in public. But the truth is messier than that. What I actually felt was something closer to math, a running calculation I'd been doing since the day we met, the same calculation I did every time he raised his voice a little too loud in a restaurant, every time his friends laughed a little too easily at my expense. How much smaller do I need to make myself for this to stop? Is it working yet? Is it ever going to work? It never had. I just hadn't let myself finish that sentence before. I thought about my mother, 4,000 miles away, who used to tell me that a woman's dignity was the one thing nobody could repossess unless she signed it over herself. I thought about how many times over the last 2 years I had quietly, politely signed it over anyway, a little at a time, at dinners exactly like this one, because leaving felt harder than shrinking. Then he stood up, raised his glass, and I knew, with the sick, lurching certainty of someone who has been humiliated by the same man enough times to recognize the wind-up, exactly what was coming. "To the women," Marcus said, loud enough that 3 neighboring tables went quiet, "who get left behind." The laughter that followed wasn't even cruel, exactly. That was almost worse. It was comfortable, practiced, like this was a bit they did, and I was simply the prop that made it work. I stared at the dead carnation. I counted the beads of condensation on my water glass. 4, 5, 6, because if I counted hard enough, maybe I wouldn't have to feel my face burning, wouldn't have to feel every set of eyes in that gold-lit dining room sliding toward the sad black woman in the emerald dress, who apparently couldn't even keep a man like Marcus interested. Crystal clinked somewhere behind me. The smell of grilled sea bass and burnt sugar from someone's dessert cart drifted past. Ordinary sounds, ordinary smells, made obscene by how loudly my own humiliation was ringing in my ears. I was already rehearsing my exit. Napkin folded just so. Chair pushed in quietly. A walk to the elevator bank executed with just enough dignity that nobody could say they watched me run. And that's when the ambient music cut out, not faded. Cut, mid-phrase, like someone had put a hand flat over the speaker. The dining room's warm gold hush went strange and thin, and beneath the sudden quiet I heard it, a low mechanical groan, coming from the private glass elevator shaft at the far wall, the one reserved for the building's owners and their 12-figure guests. Something enormous was descending. I didn't turn around right away. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was the animal calculation of a woman who has learned that new variables in a room where she's already being watched are rarely good news. But the whole restaurant turned. Marcus's laughter died mid-syllable. And when I finally did look, I understood why. The elevator doors split apart, and white light, blinding, surgical, nothing like the honeyed lamplight of the dining room, spilled across the marble like something poured. A man stepped out of it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that he looked like he'd been carved rather than born, tall in a way that rearranged the whole geometry of the room around him. Jet black hair slicked back except for one loose comma curl that had fallen, deliberately or not, across a forehead that looked like it had never once creased an apology. A charcoal three-piece suit so precisely tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more dangerous skin. His shirt collar was open at the throat, and even from across the room I caught the glint of a heavy gold signet ring catching the light as his hand moved. He didn't look at the maitre d'. He didn't look at the sommelier already hurrying toward him with a bottle he hadn't asked for. He didn't look at the 3 linen-suited men whose net worth, combined, could probably have bought this restaurant twice over. He looked at me, and then Ryu Jin-woo, because that is who he was, though I didn't have the name yet, only the gravity of him, walked past every billionaire in that room like they were furniture, and knelt down in front of me at my table for one. The whole restaurant made a sound, not a gasp exactly, more like a held breath released all at once. I felt my heart doing something violent and stupid against my ribs. He didn't say anything at first. He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, the kind of slow that isn't hesitation but permission, letting me see every inch of the movement, and produced a single white orchid, its petals so pristine they looked lit from within. Without asking, without a word, he lifted the dead carnation out of its bud vase, set it aside on the white tablecloth like evidence, and replaced it with the orchid. The message could not have been louder if he'd shouted it. Someone decided you were worth more than what they gave you. I heard Marcus somewhere behind me say my name, thin and confused, the syllables coming apart at the edges like he wasn't sure anymore whose voice he was using. I didn't turn. For 2 years I had turned, every single time. Turned toward his voice like a plant bending toward the only light source it had ever been given, even when that light burned. I sat very still instead, and I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not relief, exactly. Something closer to the moment right before you jump into cold water, when your whole body already knows it's going to hurt and braces for it anyway. The white orchid sat trembling faintly in its vase from the vibration of 100 held breaths around us. I looked at it instead of at either man. It seemed like the only safe thing left in the room to look at. Jin-woo's eyes came up to meet mine, and I understood in that moment that whatever gentleness lived in that gesture, It was sitting directly on top of something else entirely, something patient and cold and enormous. He extended a hand toward me, wrapped, I noticed now, in a strip of white cloth just beginning to bloom red at the knuckles. Blood. Fresh. "The dead is called in," he said, voice quiet enough that only I could hear it, and somehow that made it louder than anything Marcus had shouted all night. "Come home." The penthouse took my breath away for reasons that had nothing to do with beauty. I don't remember the elevator ride up. I remember my hand in his grip loose enough that I could have pulled away at any point, which somehow made it more frightening, not less, because it meant he wasn't holding me there. I was choosing to stay. I remember the doors opening onto a space so vast it seemed to swallow the concept of a ceiling, all deep velvet shadow pooling in the corners, floor-to-ceiling glass smeared with cold blue neon bleeding up from the streets 30 floors below. "Sit," he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. Just a fact, delivered the way you'd tell someone the time. I sat. The sofa gave under me with a soft, expensive sigh. Somewhere out past the ruined glass wall the city hummed on, oblivious, 30 stories down, tail lights threading red through the rain like something bleeding slowly into the dark. I remember focusing on a single point of ice blue neon reflected in the window glass, some sign advertising a Nora Bang or a pharmacy or a nightclub, warping and rippling every time the rain shifted, because fixing my eyes on it felt like the only way to keep the rest of the room from spinning. I want to describe the fear correctly, because I think people imagine terror as something loud, screaming, running, your pulse in your throat. It wasn't like that. It was quiet. Social terror curdling, slow, into something more animal. Claustrophobia dressed in silk sheets and $1,000 throw pillows. I sat very still on a sofa the color of dried blood and catalogued every exit the way my mother taught me to catalog exits in a room full of white people who might at any second decide you didn't belong there. 2 doors. 1 elevator, requiring a key I didn't have. Floor-to-ceiling glass I couldn't break even if I'd wanted to try. I filed it all away out of pure habit, the way you check the locks on a house you already know is safe, because some part of me had learned a long time ago that safety was a feeling, not a fact, and feelings lied. Jin-woo moved through his own home like weather, unhurried, total. He crossed to a mahogany desk near the window, and I watched, because I was watching everything now, cataloging him the way I'd cataloged the exits, as he unwrapped the bloodied cloth from his knuckles with a terrifying, precise gentleness, like he was handling something breakable that happened to be his own hand. And that's when I saw it. Half hidden beneath a brass paperweight on the corner of his desk, a photograph, worn soft at the corners the way paper gets when it's been held too many times, creased down the middle like it had once been folded into a pocket, then smoothed back out, over and over, until the crease stopped being an accident and became a habit. It was me, 8 months younger, my hair different, damp, plastered to my forehead. I didn't recognize the moment the photo had caught, didn't recognize the rain in it, or the streetlight glare, but I recognized my own face, mid-laugh, unguarded in a way I hadn't been unguarded in a long time. I didn't say anything. My mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. My mind kept trying to arrange the facts into something that made sense and kept failing. A stranger's penthouse, a stranger's blood, a photograph of my own laughing face folded and unfolded so many times the crease had gone soft as cloth. Somewhere underneath the fear, something else was starting to stir, quiet and unwelcome. The recognition of being known, not watched, known. There is a version of that word that feels like violation and a version that feels like being found, and standing in that cold velvet room I honestly could not yet tell which one I was living inside. I thought about all the men who had looked straight through me at that rooftop table an hour ago, and I thought about this one, kneeling on marble with his own blood on his hands, who had apparently spent 8 months looking at nothing else. I noticed, too, in the way you notice small useless details when your mind is trying to protect itself from a larger one, that his desk held almost nothing else personal. No family photos in frames, no mementos, no clutter of a life lived comfortably. Just ledgers stacked with military precision, a single crystal decanter of something amber and expensive, and my own creased, soft-cornered face tucked beneath a paperweight like the one indulgence he'd allowed himself in an otherwise ruthlessly disciplined existence. It told me more about him, that empty desk, than any of the blood or the guns or the velvet shadows had managed to. A door somewhere behind me opened without a knock. A violation, I understood instantly, that would have gotten anyone else killed, and a man staggered and holding his own shoulder, blood webbing dark through his shirt in a pattern like a cracked windshield. Jin-woo didn't raise his voice. That was the thing I would learn about him fastest and hold on to longest. He never needed to. "Where?" he said. Just that. One word, flat as a blade laid on a table. The bleeding man answered in rapid Korean, low and urgent. I understood none of the words. I understood everything about the temperature of the room, which dropped so fast I felt gooseflesh rise along my arms. Jinwoo's expression didn't change. That was the horror of it. No flare of anger, no tightening jaw, just a stillness settling over him like frost forming on glass. And then, in the same level voice he'd used to ask me to sit, he said something short, final. The kind of sentence you don't need a translator for, because the bleeding man's face went the color of the tablecloth back at the restaurant, and he was gone from the room within seconds, moving like his life depended on the speed of his exit, which, I understood now, it very much did. I sat with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone pale, replaying the sentence over and over, even though I hadn't understood a single syllable of it. Somewhere in my chest, a small, treacherous voice was asking a question I didn't want answered. What happens to people who disobey him? I already knew, in the way you know the ending of a story you haven't been told yet. I just didn't know if that fact was supposed to frighten me or steady me, and the not knowing frightened me more than either answer would have. Jin-woo turned back to me, and the frost was gone. Just gone, like it had never existed, replaced by something almost soft around his eyes. As he studied my face for a reaction I was trying very hard not to give him, I heard the metallic snick of a lighter somewhere off to my left, one of his men, lighting a cigarette he probably wasn't supposed to be smoking indoors. And underneath the cologne and the leather and the cold air-conditioned hum of the penthouse, I caught the sharp copper tang of the blood, still drying on the cloth he'd set down on his desk. That was when the intercom buzzed. Harsh, electronic, obscene in the velvet quiet. A voice crackled through it, tight with barely restrained authority. "Sir, there's a man downstairs, American, says his name is Marcus. He's brought 2 of his own security, and he's demanding to see the woman." I felt every hair on my arms rise at once. The elevator ride down to the security floor felt different than the one going up, colder, somehow, though the temperature hadn't changed. Jin-woo walked half a step behind me now, not beside me, and I understood without being told that this was deliberate. He wanted me to see this happen. He wanted me to choose to watch. The room he led me into had no windows, just a wall of monitors glowing pale blue in the dark, throwing flickering light across both our faces. He came to stand behind me, not touching, not yet, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him even through the chill of the room. On the screens, black and white CCTV footage of Marcus's downtown office, feeds I didn't understand how Jin-woo had access to and didn't dare ask. Men in dark suits, not thugs, I realized with a jolt, but lawyers, moving with the same cold efficiency Jin-woo's own soldiers had, walking floor to floor with folders and tablets, freezing accounts, sealing filing cabinets, escorting stunned employees out of offices that, an hour ago, had belonged to them. I watched Marcus's company come apart in real time, silent and bloodless and absolute, and something warm and unfamiliar and slightly shameful bloomed low in my stomach. Not sympathy, the opposite of sympathy. Jin-woo's hand settled on my shoulders, not gripping, just resting there, heavy and warm, a weight I felt in my molars. "Watch," he said quietly, close enough to my ear that I felt it more than heard it. I watched. On the monitor, Marcus's face had gone the color of old ash. He was shouting at someone off camera, spit flying, his oversized watch catching the fluorescent light every time he slammed his hand on a desk that, technically, was no longer his. I couldn't hear him, but I didn't need to. I'd seen that face 100 times across 100 dinner tables. I knew exactly what kind of ugly was coming out of his mouth. And then, as if the universe wanted to reward my curiosity with a gut punch, the audio feed crackled to life. "She's not just some nobody," Marcus was screaming, his voice tinny and desperate through the speaker. "I have leverage. I know things about her. I have access. If this doesn't stop, I will sell everything I know to whoever's paying. Your rivals will pay top dollar for that little teacher, believe me." I felt Jin-woo's hands go very, very still on my shoulders. I want to tell you what that stillness felt like, because it was worse than any shout would have been. Marcus's voice, tinny through the speaker, had said my worth out loud in the ugliest possible terms. A bargaining chip, a thing to be sold to the highest bidder, and some old, exhausted part of me flinched at hearing it, the same part that had spent 2 years absorbing his casual cruelty and calling it love. But underneath the flinch, something new was rising. Anger that didn't belong to the frightened woman at the rooftop table anymore. Anger that felt, for the first time, entirely mine. Jin-woo's thumbs pressed, once, into the muscle at the top of my shoulders. Not painful, just present, an anchor. On the screen, Marcus kept shouting into a room that had already stopped listening to him, his voice fraying at the edges into something closer to begging. I watched the last of his composure come apart, piece by piece, on a black and white feed 30 floors below us, and I did not look away once. The rain had started again by the time he told me the story. Real rain, this time, hammering the penthouse glass in long silver ropes that turned the neon city below into something smeared and impressionistic. I was still standing near the window, arms wrapped around myself, trying to process what I'd just watched. The surgical dismantling of a man's entire life, ordered with less effort than most people spend picking a restaurant. Jin-woo came to stand beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. 8 months ago, he said finally, there was an accident on Yoksumdero. Rain like this. I turned to look at him. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed somewhere past the glass, past the city, into some private middle distance I couldn't follow him into. A woman was struck crossing against the light, older, confused. She didn't speak Korean well. She'd only just arrived from visiting family abroad. Traffic didn't stop. People stepped around her like she was. Furniture, debris. I felt something cold slide down my spine, because I already knew, with the sick certainty of a story circling back on itself, exactly where this was going. A woman knelt down in the middle of that intersection, he continued, in the rain, in traffic, and held that stranger's hand until the ambulance came. Didn't know her name, didn't ask what she was worth, just stayed. His eyes finally came to mine. That woman was my mother. I felt the floor of the whole night shift under me. Somewhere in the last 2 years I had learned to expect that kindness always came with a hidden invoice attached, that nothing given freely stayed free for long. And here was a man who ran half the illegal shipping routes on the Korean peninsula, telling me, in a voice gone rough at the edges, that a single unpaid debt of kindness had rearranged the entire architecture of his life. I didn't know what to do with a story like that. I still don't, if I'm honest. I only knew that I believed every word of it, and that the believing terrified me more than any of the blood I'd already seen that night. The photograph on his desk, the crease worn soft from folding and unfolding. 8 months, exactly the length of time since. "I didn't even give you my name," I whispered. "I didn't. I found it anyway." His voice had dropped to something almost rough. "I have spent 8 months finding out everything there is to know about a woman who knelt in traffic for a stranger and then walked away without asking for anything. And I have spent every day since deciding what I owed her for it." The air between us had changed texture entirely. This was not the cold, terrifying precision of the boss who had ordered a man's life dismantled with 2 flat sentences. This was something else, something raw and unguarded, a man handing me the one piece of himself that wasn't armored. "You don't owe me," I started. "I know what I owe." he said, quietly, cutting through my sentence without raising his voice at all. I have known for 8 months. The only thing I didn't know was what it would feel like to finally say it out loud. There was a rawness in his face just then that had nothing to do with the boss who ordered lives dismantled with 2 flat words. I found myself leaning very slightly toward him without deciding to. The way a plant leans toward a window it hasn't consciously noticed is there, and I hated how natural it felt, and I did it anyway. The window behind him exploded inward. The sound arrived before the understanding did, a concussive crack that I felt in my sternum before my brain had even processed it as an explosion. And then the world became glass. Glittering, weightless, terrible glass, filling the air like something out of a snow globe shaken by a furious god, and the roar of wind and rain came screaming into the penthouse where a wall of window used to be. I was on the floor. I don't remember deciding to get there. Jin-woo's body was over mine. When had that happened? When had he crossed the space between us, his weight pressing me flat against the marble, his arm curled protectively over my skull the same way? I would realize later with a lurch that his mother must have held that stranger in the rain. Sirens, somewhere below, already wailing. Smoke and ash and the ozone tang of something electrical, sparking somewhere in the ruined wall behind us. Jin-woo lifted his head first. I watched him take in the destruction, the shattered window, the curtains sucked halfway out into the storm, flapping like something wounded, with an expression that had gone utterly, terrifyingly blank. "We move," he said, already pulling me up by the arm, his grip no longer gentle at all. Now, there was no room left in me for fear as separate from motion. I remember being half carried down a service stairwell that smelled of scorched wiring and rain blown in sideways through 100 broken panes. Remember his good hand splayed protectively across the back of my skull the entire way down. Remember thinking, absurdly, that I had known this man for barely 2 hours and had already trusted him with the single most vulnerable part of my body without once being asked to. I didn't examine that thought too closely. There wasn't time. There would be time later, I told myself, and I was wrong, because there was never going to be a version of this night with room left over for quiet reflection. The banquet hall, when we arrived an hour later, felt like stepping into a different century. Neutral ground, one of his men had murmured to me in the car. A summit, called on short notice, syndicate elders and rival bosses gathering under an old truce none of them fully trusted anymore. I wore black, silk, heavy, structured like armor across my shoulders. Jin-woo's staff had produced it from somewhere in the 20 minutes we'd had to prepare, along with a thin heirloom bracelet of dark beads that felt, when I fastened it around my wrist, like being handed a piece of someone else's history to carry. The room was thick with cigar smoke, curling blue-gray under low gold light, and I felt the weight of every armed man stationed along the walls like a physical pressure against my skin. My fear, I noticed with something like surprise, had stopped feeling like shrinking. It had started, instead, to feel like a spine. I thought about the rooftop restaurant, 3 nights and 1 lifetime ago, where I had counted water droplets to keep from feeling the eyes of an entire dining room sliding over my humiliation. I was still being watched now, more closely, by more dangerous men, and yet I found I could sit with it. Could let my shoulders stay back, my chin stay level, could hold a silver-haired stranger's gaze across a banquet table without flinching. In a way the old version of me, the 4th-grade teacher version, would not have recognized. I didn't know yet whether that change was armor or something more permanent. I only knew I didn't want to give it back. We were 3 courses into a meal I couldn't taste when a man at the head table, silver-haired, soft-spoken, terrifying in the unhurried way only very old power can be terrifying, rose with a champagne flute lifted toward me. "To the woman," he said, smiling with teeth that didn't reach his eyes, "who's brought our young lion so far off his leash." I saw Jin-woo's face change before I understood why. His eyes went wide, genuinely wide, the first unguarded fear I'd seen cross that composed face all night, and his hand shot out and struck the champagne flute from my fingers before it had even reached my lips. Crystal shattered against the marble floor, pale liquid spreading in a thin, spidering pool. "Don't," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go before. "Don't drink anything in this room." The gunfire started before anyone could ask him why. It came from everywhere and nowhere. The lights, the marble, the tension in the room, all detonating into chaos in the same half-second. Bodies moved, tables overturned. I heard myself scream, though I wouldn't remember doing it until much later, and then Jin-woo's whole body was slamming into mine, throwing us both to the ground behind the shelter of an overturned banquet table. I felt it before I understood it, the impact against him, the way his body went rigid, then heavy, then wrong, collapsing half onto me with a suddenness that had nothing to do with tackling me for cover, and everything to do with something tearing through muscle and bone. Jin-woo, his blood was on my hands before I even registered I'd reached for him. Hot, shocking, obscenely much of it, blooming dark through the charcoal wool at his shoulder, spreading between my fingers as I pressed down on instinct alone, some buried memory of first aid training screaming at me to apply pressure, apply pressure. Time did something strange in that moment, slowed and stretched, the way I imagine it does for everyone, right before the worst thing that has ever happened to them finishes happening. I could hear my own pulse louder than the gunfire. I could feel the exact texture of the marble under my palms, cold and slightly gritty with plaster dust, and some small absurd corner of my mind was cataloging it all with the same detached precision I used to catalog exits, as if noticing everything hard enough might let me control some small piece of it. His eyes found mine through the smoke and the ringing in my ears. Something in them, some armored, untouchable god thing I'd watched him wear all night, had cracked wide open, and underneath it was just a man, bleeding, looking at me like I was the only fixed point left in a world coming apart. Around us, through the drifting smoke, I could see boots, many boots, closing in a slow circle, unhurried, the way predators close on something already wounded. I don't remember agreeing to let them take him wherever they took him. Don't remember the moment his hand slipped out of mine, only the sudden cold absence of it, and then rough hands on my own arms instead, dragging me backward through smoke that stung my eyes and coated the back of my throat like ash. Someone shouted orders in a language I didn't speak. Someone else laughed, actually laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound, like this was sport. I don't remember most of the drive to the warehouse. I remember concrete floor, freezing even through my dress, biting up into my knees the second they shoved me down onto it. I remember the metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooding the back of my throat, and dim halogen lights buzzing somewhere overhead with a sound like trapped insects. And I remember Marcus's voice before I saw his face. "Well," he said, and even now, even in that state, he still managed to sound like he was making small talk at a fundraiser. "Look who finally made it interesting." He crouched in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. The same cologne he'd worn to that rooftop dinner 3 nights and a lifetime ago, mixing sourly with sweat. His linen suit was rumpled now, sweat darkened at the collar, and one of the rival boss's men stood close behind him, with the loose, proprietary posture of a man who owns the room, and everyone shivering in it. "You could have just laughed it off," Marcus said, almost gently, like he was disappointed in me. "The toast, the carnation, that's all it ever had to be. Instead, you had to go and become this." I looked at him, really looked, at the sweat beading along his hairline, at the way his hand trembled where it hovered near his own tie, at the desperate, performative calm he was wrapping around himself like it might actually hold. And for the first time in years, looking at Marcus, I didn't feel small. I felt something colder, something almost like pity, if pity could have teeth. "You're scared," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You've been scared this whole time. That's the only reason any of this happened." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, something closer to the panic of a man watching his own script fall apart in real time. He had built his whole life on the assumption that fear made people small, made them foldable, and he had never once, in 2 years, had to reckon with a version of me that didn't fold. You always needed someone smaller than you in the room. I went on, quiet, almost gentle, because I realized somewhere in the middle of the sentence that this was the truest thing I had ever said to him. That's the only kind of room you ever knew how to survive in. His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Above us, faint at first, and then unmistakable, a new sound began to thread through the buzzing halogens, a low, rhythmic thudding, growing louder, shaking dust loose from the corrugated iron roof in fine gray drifts, helicopter blades. Marcus's head snapped upward. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. The roof came apart before the doors did. I have never, before or since, witnessed anything like what happened in the next 4 minutes. Tactical lights, blinding and white, sliced down through the dust and gun smoke like something biblical. Men in black poured through breach points I hadn't even known existed, moving with a silent, brutal efficiency that made the rival boss's guards look like children playing dress-up. And at the center of it, unmistakable, even soaked in blood, and half his suit torn away from the wound at his shoulder, was Jin-woo. He didn't look like a wounded man. He looked like something the wound had made more dangerous, not less, every movement stripped down to pure, scorched earth intention. I watched him put down 2 armed men with his bare hands in the time it took me to draw a single breath. This wasn't the controlled violence of the boss ordering a bleeding lieutenant out of a room. This was obsession wearing a human shape, and it was terrifying, and some shameful, primal part of me had never in my life felt safer. The smoke cleared enough that our eyes met across the warehouse floor. I don't know if I imagined it or not, but I swear something in his face changed the instant our eyes met. Some tightly wound thread finally allowed to go slack, just for a heartbeat, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying his whole life, without realizing how heavy it had gotten. I opened my mouth. I don't even know what I meant to say. His name, maybe? Some warning. And that was the exact moment Marcus's shaking hand seized a fallen guard's dropped pistol, dragged me backward by the hair with a strength born entirely of panic, and pressed the barrel to the base of my skull, which brings us back to where I started. Jin-woo, kneeling in a puddle of someone else's blood, his own soaking dark through his ruined charcoal wool, both his weapons already surrendered on the concrete between us. "I will sign over the ports," he said again, and this close I could hear what the flat, level tone had been costing him the whole time. A control so total it had to be constructed, board by board, over something enormous and barely leashed. The shipping lines. The entire $200 million ledger. Just take your hands off her. Marcus's breath was ragged and hot against my ear, his whole arm trembling so badly the muzzle kept tapping an unsteady rhythm against my scalp. "You think I'm stupid," Marcus said, and his voice cracked right down the middle of the sentence. "The second I let her go, your men, no one moves," Jin-woo said, without turning his head, and I felt rather than saw the dozen black-clad men behind him freeze exactly where they stood, weapons lowered, utterly obedient to a kneeling man who had just given away everything he owned. That's when I saw it. A glint, barely there, catching the tactical light for a fraction of a second. A thin blade, sliding free from the cuff of Jin-woo's ruined sleeve into his open palm, hidden from Marcus's angle but not from mine. His eyes lifted to mine across the 6 feet of blood-slicked concrete between us, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, exactly what he was asking. He wasn't going to move without my permission. Not this time. Not ever again. The call was mine. I thought, in the strange suspended half-second before I answered him, about the dead carnation on the rooftop table, about the water glass I'd counted condensation on instead of letting myself cry, about every single moment in the last 2 years I had let someone else decide what I was worth and what I was owed. I thought about my mother's voice, and about a stranger kneeling in traffic for another stranger, and about a man who had just knelt twice in 1 week, once for an empire, once, I understood now, simply because he trusted me enough to let me choose. I felt the muzzle shaking against my skull. I felt Marcus's fear like a living thing pressed against my back. And I felt, underneath all of it, something in me finally, completely stopped bending. I let my eyes fall shut for half a second. Then I gave the smallest possible nod. Everything after the nod happened both instantly and in unbearable slow motion, the way I imagine violence always does to the person standing closest to its center. I felt Marcus's grip on my hair falter for just a fraction of a second, some animal instinct in him sensing the shift in the room before his mind had caught up to it, and in that fraction of a second I understood exactly why Jin-woo had waited for my signal instead of simply acting. He hadn't been asking permission out of weakness. He'd been giving me, for possibly the first time in 2 years, the final say over what happened to my own body in a room full of men deciding things about it. The blade moved faster than I could track it, a single bright arc through the tactical light, and the rival guard braced behind Marcus went down before he'd even finished raising his own weapon, the blade buried to the hilt at the base of his throat. Marcus screamed, high and broken, and the pistol clattered from his shaking hand to the concrete with a sound that seemed to echo forever in that vast, ruined warehouse. Warm blood misted across the ivory linen of Marcus's suit, ruining it in a way that felt, in that moment, like poetic justice written by someone with a very dark sense of humor. He dropped to his knees in it, sobbing, genuine, ugly, gasping sobs, the sound of every ounce of inherited confidence finally, permanently deserting him. For one long moment, nobody in that warehouse moved at all. Even Jin-woo's men, still frozen in their obedient half-crouch along the shattered doorway, seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what the woman standing in the wreckage of 2 worlds was going to do next. The halogens buzzed on overhead, indifferent. Somewhere far off, sirens were finally beginning to thread through the night, too late to matter, exactly the way they always seem to be too late to matter for people like me, until someone decides to make it otherwise. I didn't look at him again. I stepped over him, over the man who had made me shrink at 100 dinner tables, who had called me left behind in front of a room full of strangers, and I walked toward the man still kneeling in the blood and the dirt, waiting, silent, for whatever verdict I decided to give him. The balcony was cold when we finally made it back, 3 floors of a temporary safe house below street level, the wind biting straight through the borrowed coat someone had draped over my shoulders. Below us, Seoul glittered on, indifferent and endless, neon smearing gold and blue and magenta across wet pavement like nothing at all had happened. Someone had wrapped a blanket around my shoulders at some point during the drive here, though I couldn't have told you who, or when, or what street we'd taken to arrive. My hands were still faintly stained rust brown at the knuckles, dried into the creases of my fingers no matter how many times I'd rubbed them against the blanket's rough wool. I kept looking down at them like they belonged to someone else. In a way, I suppose they did. They belonged to whoever I'd become in the last 3 days, and I hadn't yet decided how I felt about meeting her. Jin-woo cleaned the blood from my hands himself, knelt in front of me on that cold balcony floor, the same posture he'd offered Marcus, I realized, except this time there was nothing being surrendered, nothing being bought, just a damp towel and his hands, careful and slow, working the dried blood from between my fingers one at a time like it was the only task left in the world worth doing correctly. "You're free," he said quietly, not looking up. "Whatever happens next, the ledger, the ports, all of it. You don't owe me anything for tonight. You never did." I looked down at him, at the loose comma curl fallen, finally and completely, across his forehead, at the dragon tattoo peeking from beneath his torn, ruined cuff, at a man who had knelt for me twice in 72 hours, once to surrender an empire, once just to wash blood from my hands, and asked for nothing either time. I reached down, fisted both hands in the ruined lapels of his charcoal jacket, and pulled him up to meet me. "I know I'm free," I said. "I'm choosing this anyway." The kiss that followed erased, for one suspended moment, every rooftop humiliation, every dead carnation, every night I had made myself smaller to survive a room. The city wind bit at us both, and neither of us moved away from it. And then, muffled against his ruined jacket, a phone began to ring. Not his usual line, a different tone, sharp and encrypted, one I hadn't heard before. I felt him go still against me, and in that stillness I recognized something I'd learned to read fluently over the last 72 hours, the particular quality of quiet that meant the next thing said in this room was going to matter more than almost anything that had come before it. Below us the city kept glittering on, gold and blue and magenta smeared across wet pavement. utterly unbothered by the fact that somewhere 30 stories up, an empire, a debt, and whatever this was between us had all just collided into something with no name yet. "Who is it?" I asked. He pulled back just far enough to look at the screen, and whatever color remained in his face after everything we'd survived that night drained out of it entirely. "The elders," he said quietly. "They just found out you're alive."